There's a 15-second clip on my phone that I can't bring myself to delete. It's not a war scene, it's not a riot, it's not even particularly dramatic. It's Mike Johnson standing in front of a few microphones, talking about the Epstein-Files. He smiles. He shrugs a little. And then he says the line that keeps me up at night. There's nothing to hide. Reporters chuckle softly in the background. Staffers glance at their phones. Everyone treats it like just another Washington soundbite. But I froze when I heard it. Because I've been on the other side of a phrase like that. I've sat in rooms with no windows, no cameras, no phones, where the documents on the table could shatter careers and sometimes entire institutions. I've watched powerful people beg for words like nothing to hide to be said in public, while behind closed doors they fight tooth and nail to hide as much as they possibly can. Let me paint you a picture. You're in a secure room. The air is a little too cold, the light's a little too bright. On the table, manila folders, evidence binders, USB drives, and small clear bags with barcodes. Everyone has signed in. Everyone has locked away their phones. There are no leaks from this room that aren't intentional. On the first page of one of those files is a name you recognize from cable news, or from a ballot, or from a donor list. Under that name, in dry legal language, are things you wouldn't want to believe about anyone, let alone someone who holds power. That's the world the Epstein-Files come from. And that's why Johnson's casual little smile rattled me more than most people. Because when you've actually dealt with evidence of abuse at that level, when you've read victim statements that were never meant to see daylight, you understand immediately that this is not about gossip. This isn't about celebrity curiosity or internet conspiracy boards. This is about whether some of the most insulated people in America can ever be forced to live under the same rules as the rest of us. Here's what really scares me. I remember faces, not just files. I remember a young woman in another case, sitting across from us in one of those windowless rooms, clutching a tissue until it tore in her hand. She had to repeat her story 3 times because 3 different groups needed to hear it directly: lawyers, investigators, staffers. By the time she walked out, she looked empty. And then after she left, the conversation turned to timing, optics, and institutional reputation. Those were the words that mattered. Not justice, not safety. So when I see the political class circling around the Epstein documents, joking, posturing, talking about transparency in front of cameras, I don't hear transparency. I hear calculation. I hear people asking themselves a brutal question. What happens if these names come out? Not what happens to the victims, but what happens to us, to our party, our donors, our allies, our narratives. You can almost feel the panic under the surface. And hanging over all of this is another, darker layer: national security. Most people don't think of it that way, but they should. A man like Epstein was not just a predator. He was a potential control point, a pressure point. If even a fraction of what's been alleged is true, he had access to people whose decisions affect wars, markets, treaties, intelligence operations. Now imagine how useful that kind of leverage is to foreign intelligence services, to rival factions, to anyone willing to trade human beings for power. That's not tabloid drama. That's a structural vulnerability in the way our system protects or fails to protect itself. Let me walk you through this. When Mike Johnson stands up and says, "Nothing to hide," he's not just making a casual remark about an old case. He is, whether he fully understands it or not, placing himself between the public and one of the ugliest mirrors we've ever had the chance to look into. He's taking a position on what we get to know, how much we get to know, and when we get to know it. And I know from experience that those decisions are almost never made purely out of principle. Most people will watch that clip once and move on. For them, it's just part of the noise. Another politician, another scandal, another set of files they assume they'll never see. But I can't unhear it. Because I've watched what happens when powerful people think their secrets will never truly see the light. I've watched what happens when institutions decide that their own survival matters more than the truth, more than the victims, more than the country's faith in the system. That's why I'm making this video. Not to gossip about flight logs or to sensationalize the pain of survivors. I'm doing it because what Johnson just did with the Epstein-Files, what he delayed, what he allowed, what he signaled, will tell us something fundamental about who this system is really built to protect. And once you understand that, you'll see why this moment is a lot bigger than one man, one scandal, or one set of redacted PDFs. By the time we're done, you'll understand why that 15-second clip isn't just another headline. Why, for me, it's the most chilling hint yet of how far our leaders will go to keep the ugliest parts of our reality safely out of you. Why you should listen to me. Before we go any further, you deserve to know who's talking to you and why I'm this worked up about a stack of documents most people will never lay eyes on. Because I'm not a YouTuber who fell down a rabbit hole. I'm someone who used to live in that rabbit hole. I helped build some of the tunnels. For years, my job put me at the choke points where information either reached the public or got quietly buried. I worked with congressional oversight staff, legal teams, and investigators whose job was to review sensitive materials from the Justice Department and other agencies. That phrase sounds dull. Sensitive materials. It's anything, but it means the stuff that keeps lawyers up at night. It means files that, if mishandled, don't just embarrass a politician. They shake markets, ruin alliances, or shatter public trust in entire institutions. Let me walk you through the first time I realized what I'd signed up for. They took my phone at the door. Standard practice in secure areas. I remember the guard placing it in a little numbered cubby like I was checking a code, and the absurdity of that, this cheap piece of glass and metal holding my entire life, treated like a biohazard. Then came the non-disclosure agreement. A simple form, a few paragraphs of legalese I'd seen 100 times. But this one came with a warning. Violating it could be prosecuted under federal law. Not, you'll get fired. Not, you'll embarrass your boss. Federal law. Inside the room, there were maybe 8 of us. 2 lawyers, a senior investigator, a staff director, and a few people like me who did the quiet work of reading, indexing, connecting dots. The air conditioning was too cold, as if they wanted to make sure no one got too comfortable. On the table, a neat stack of manila folders with classification stamps and case numbers. We weren't dealing with Epstein that day. We were dealing with another high-profile abuse case, involving someone with enough connections that every decision had consequences. The first time I saw a name I recognized, it made my stomach drop. Not because it belonged to some cartoon villain, but because it belonged to a person I'd seen on TV smiling next to their family, talking about values and leadership. Next to that name were allegations written in clinical, almost sterile language. No adjectives, just dates, locations, ages. The age column is the one that gets you. You can skim the rest, you can pretend you're doing document review, but when you see a 2-digit number that starts with a 1 and ends in something far too small, that's when the reality punches through. Let me paint you a picture of what happens next, because this is the part most people never see. The conversation doesn't start with, how do we get justice? It starts with, what's our jurisdiction? What's our exposure? Who else knows about this? You hear phrases like protecting the integrity of the institution and avoiding undue political fallout. Those are the polite translations of a darker instinct, self-preservation. And if you listen closely, you start to realize something that fundamentally changed how I see this country. The system is very, very good at protecting itself. It is much less consistent about protecting people. I've been in closed-door briefings where the primary concern wasn't whether a powerful man had hurt teenagers, but whether releasing certain evidence would unfairly politicize the situation. I've watched people argue with straight faces that keeping victim statements sealed was actually a form of compassion, because public scrutiny would be too traumatic for them. And sure, there's some truth to that. But when you've seen the same argument deployed again and again, always in cases where the accused has connections, influence, or a donor history, you start to notice the pattern. Here's what really scares me. Once you learn how to read those patterns, you can't unsee them. You start to recognize the telltale signs. The sudden concern with process. The insistence on letting the system work. The repeated promise that everything will come out in due time, coupled with a quiet, relentless effort to make sure due time never actually arrives. I've watched hearings get scheduled and then abruptly postponed when a witness turned out to be more honest than expected. I've seen subpoenas drafted, revised, watered down, and finally never sent. I've watched tough-sounding letters to federal agencies go out with carefully tailored language that everyone in the room knew would allow the agency to withhold exactly the most damaging material. That's not speculation. That's my lived experience. And no, I'm not going to drop names here for 2 reasons. First, because some of those cases are still officially ongoing, even if they've been effectively frozen in place. Second, because this isn't about one party or one scandal. I've seen Democrats bury things. I've seen Republicans bury things. I've watched career bureaucrats who never appear on a ballot quietly make decisions about what the public needs to know. Different ideologies, same instinct, protect the machine. Over time, you start to lose the luxury of naivete. You stop assuming that documents are sealed purely because of national security or victim privacy. You realize those phrases can be sincere, but they can also be shields. And once you've seen how easily they're used as shields, you become very interested in who exactly is holding them up. Now, let me be clear about something. Secrecy isn't always evil. There are investigations that genuinely would collapse if every detail were broadcast in real time. There are victims who absolutely deserve privacy. There are intelligence sources who would be killed if their identities were exposed. I've sat in on briefings where keeping something classified undeniably saved lives. I've voted in favor of redactions I still believe were necessary. But I've also watched those same tools, classification, sealed records, sensitive law enforcement information, get stretched beyond their intended purpose, used to protect reputations instead of people. And when you've seen that happen enough times, you stop taking phrases like nothing to hide at face value. You start asking, according to whom? Now imagine you're me with that background, and you hear that Congress is debating whether to release or withhold documents related to Jeffrey Epstein, the epicenter of one of the most grotesque abuse networks of our era. You hear that the Speaker of the House has the power to speed that process up or slow it down. You see him hesitate, stall, shuffle the calendar, and then suddenly flip, publicly, confidently, nothing to hide. You don't hear a neutral statement. You hear a decision shaped by the same forces I've been describing: institutional fear, political calculus, donor anxiety, legal risk management. I know what those meetings sound like because I've sat in them. Someone lays out the worst-case scenarios. Someone else talks about protecting the credibility of the process. No one wants to be the one who says out loud what everyone is thinking. What if someone we rely on is in those files? That's the lens I'm bringing to this. Not the lens of a conspiracy theorist, but the lens of someone who has watched the sausage get made. Someone who knows how easy it is to turn a promise of full transparency into a slow drip of half-truths and heavily redacted pages. Someone who understands that in politics, a pivot from obstruction to enthusiasm almost never happens without a backstory. So when I tell you that what Johnson just did with the Epstein-Files matters, it's not because I read a headline and got excited. It's because from where I'm standing, his actions fit into a pattern I recognize all too well, a pattern where the public is always one step behind what powerful people already know. And if you're wondering what exactly these Epstein files are, how they're structured, and why controlling their release is such a powerful weapon, that's exactly where we're going next. What the Epstein files actually are and aren't. Most people talk about the Epstein files like they're a single folder sitting in a dusty cabinet somewhere, labeled client list in big red letters. I wish it were that simple. If it were, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be arguing about committees, subpoenas, redactions, jurisdiction. We wouldn't be watching politicians twist themselves into knots just to avoid saying out loud what these documents really represent. Let me walk you through this slowly, clearly, because understanding the anatomy of the Epstein files is the foundation of everything that follows. When I say Epstein files, I'm talking about a sprawling ecosystem of documents generated across years of investigations, lawsuits, raids, interviews, plea negotiations, intelligence assessments, and civil litigation. Not one file. Many. Hundreds of thousands of pages, spread across multiple agencies and jurisdictions. You've got the FBI 302s, the recorded summaries of interviews with witnesses, staffers, pilots, victims, former associates. Some of those interviews were useful. Others were masterclasses in evasive half-answers disguised as cooperation. Anyone who's ever read a 302 knows how to interpret the gaps, the convenient, I don't recall, the sudden memory fog when the questions get too close to a certain name. Then there are the flight manifests. People obsess over those, and I understand why. They're tangible. They have names. But flight manifests aren't proof of a crime. They're context, big, important, directional context. They show patterns. Who traveled frequently? Who traveled alone? Who traveled repeatedly to the same locations that victims describe in their statements. But they don't tell the whole story. Next, the black books, Epstein's contact books. Pages of names, numbers, addresses. Some entries innocent. Some deeply suspicious. Some group together in ways that only make sense if you've studied how certain social and financial networks intersect. Think of them like the cast list for a play you're only seeing fragments of. Then you have the civil depositions, some sealed, some unsealed, some partially redacted. These are the moments when lawyers sit down in a room with a witness and ask them questions under oath. If you've never watched someone testify about trauma in real time, you might not understand how grueling these sessions are. Survivors recount things that should never have happened once, let alone repeatedly. Lawyers try to poke holes. Defense teams try to confuse, exhaust, discredit. And all of that becomes part of the record. And those aren't even the most sensitive materials. The most sensitive records, the ones that should make every politician sweat, aren't the ones sitting in court archives. They're the internal memos, the notes from prosecutors, the emails between federal agencies, the classifications applied to certain pieces of evidence, the sealed addendums that judges reviewed but the public never saw. Then there are what I call the shadow files, evidence seized during raids on Epstein's properties, hard drives, CDs, Polaroids, logs, codes, private recordings. Some of that material has been described publicly. Some of it hasn't. And the part that hasn't is exactly the part the political class is terrified of. Let me paint you a picture of how these materials get managed. Imagine a long conference table in a Justice Department annex. 3 career attorneys, 2 supervisory agents, and a representative from the U.S. Attorney's Office sit around it. They're triaging Epstein evidence. What can be disclosed? What must be sealed? What raises national security flags? What involves minors whose identities must be protected? On one side of the table is a stack of documents that will likely see daylight at some point. On the other side is a stack that almost certainly won't. Names redacted, pages withheld under exemption codes most Americans never hear about. B6, B7, B7C, non-responsive, ongoing investigative equities. Those words matter. Because in the hands of someone who wants transparency, exemptions are used narrowly. In the hands of someone who wants control, exemptions become a fortress. Here's what really scares me, and I say this as someone who has watched this process up close. The public thinks the battle is over whether the files will be released. But the real battle is over which version of the files will be released. Will we get a raw data dump with names, timelines, financial networks? Or will we get a curated, sanitized, legally sterilized version where the only people exposed are the ones too powerless to fight back? Because the moment a politician says, "We support releasing the files," that doesn't tell you anything about what the public will actually see. It tells you what story they've decided the public is prepared to hear. I've seen this play out before, not with Epstein, but with other high-profile cases where release seemed like a victory for transparency until you actually looked at what was released and realized the guts had been surgically removed. Now imagine the Epstein documents going through that same machine. Imagine a PDF stamped redacted in part, where half the page is black boxes, and the only visible names belong to dead men or people with no political utility. Imagine the media treating that as closure, as if the story is now settled. That's why I needed to explain this before we go deeper. Because if you're picturing a single client list, you're missing the entire battlefield. And if you're assuming that releasing the files means revealing the truth, you're assuming a level of honesty this system has rarely earned. In the next, I'm going to take you back to the moment when I personally realized how this system treats cases like Epstein, not in theory, but in practice. Once you see that moment clearly, everything Johnson has done will make a lot more sense. The night I realized the system wasn't built for victims. There's one night I keep returning to whenever people ask me why I'm so wary, borderline pessimistic, about the system handling cases like Epstein. It wasn't a dramatic night. No cameras. No shouting. Just a windowless office, a stale pot of coffee, and a handful of people in suits sitting around a table that felt far too small for the weight of what we were discussing. Let me walk you through it, because this moment is the hinge for everything that follows. It's the moment when the idealistic version of me died a little. It was late, later than our meetings usually ran. The building had thinned out. You could hear the cleaning staff down the hallway, the wheels of their carts squeaking rhythmically. Inside our room, though, the air was stiff with tension. We were reviewing sealed material from a different high-profile abuse case. This wasn't Epstein, but it had the same shape, the same stench. Powerful person, vulnerable victims, networks of enablers, and the constant looming shadow of political consequence. The investigator sitting beside me clicked a remote and projected a page onto the screen. A witness statement. Simple, clinical, horrifying. There was a name, one everyone in that room recognized immediately. A name that appeared in glossy magazines, on fundraising invitations, on the kind of checks that decide elections. And next to that name, in terrifying detail, was an allegation involving a minor. Silence fell over the room, the kind of silence that doesn't feel like calm but like pressure. I remember hearing the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights, the soft tapping of someone's shoe on the floor, the intake of a breath from the staff director, a sharp, involuntary sound. And then the debates began. Not about the victim. Not about the crime. Not about how to make sure justice was done. No, the first questions were procedural. Do we have jurisdiction? Does this fall within the scope of the subpoena? Is this something we can actually pursue? After that came the political questions, the ones people hesitate to say out loud at first. What's the fallout if this becomes public? What does it do to the committee? What does it do to the party? What does it do to the institution? Let me paint you a picture, a teenage victim's sworn statement on one side of the table, and on the other, a semi-panicked discussion about optics. I remember sitting there, listening, feeling something twist inside me. I had joined this work because I believed oversight was the backbone of accountability. I believed we were the people who kept the system honest. But what I was watching wasn't honesty. It was triage, political triage. At one point, a junior counsel, good kid, too earnest for that room, leaned forward and said, "Shouldn't the priority be the victim?" He said it gently, like someone trying to remind a room of adults what moral gravity is supposed to feel like. The senior attorney exhaled, long and tired, and replied with a phrase that still chills me. "We have to think bigger than one person. Bigger than one person." Those 4 words are the quiet engine behind so much institutional corruption. They sound noble. They sound strategic. But in practice, they mean the system comes first. The institution comes first. The reputation comes first. And everything and everyone else comes second. Here's what really shook me. I watched the people in that room slowly drift toward the safest option. The most convenient option. The option that wouldn't trigger headlines or donor rage or committee panic. That meant narrowing the inquiry, stalling a subpoena, recategorizing the allegation as outside the scope of the immediate investigation. I remember leaving the building past 11 p.m., stepping into the cold night air and realizing the truth. Power flinches. Power avoids. Power protects itself. Once you've seen power flinch at the sight of a name in a file, you start to recognize that same flinch everywhere. You see it in press conferences, in delayed votes, in strategic ambiguity, in sudden reversals that don't quite add up. You see it in the way politicians talk about Epstein with performative disgust while quietly praying their name doesn't appear in an index somewhere. This is the moment I carry with me when I hear Mike Johnson talk about the Epstein-Files with that easy smile. Because I know what it looks like when people in power encounter something radioactive, something that could end careers, compromise alliances, embarrass donors, destabilize institutions. The public sees arguments about transparency. Insiders see fear. And fear is exactly what was in that room the night I realized the system wasn't built for victims. It was built to survive them. This closes where that night ended for me. Standing in the parking lot, looking back at a building full of people making choices that would shape lives they'd never have to meet. That's when I understood why the Epstein-Files terrify the political class. Because once the truth escapes the room, it stops being theirs to control. Who Epstein was to the powerful, a brief, ugly reminder. Before we can make sense of what Johnson is doing now, we have to talk honestly, uncomfortably honestly, about who Jeffrey Epstein was to the people who run this country, and in some cases, the people who run entire regions of the world. Because Epstein wasn't just a criminal. He wasn't even just a predator. He was a function, a role, a utility, a pressure point. A man whose existence at the intersection of wealth, politics, intelligence, and exploitation made him far more valuable to the powerful than the public has ever been allowed to fully understand. Let me walk you through what I mean by that. Epstein operated in that rarefied zone of American life where money and influence stop being separate currencies. At a certain level, they become interchangeable. Money buys access, access buys invulnerability, invulnerability buys more money. Epstein understood that economy perfectly. He navigated it with the ease of someone who knew how to make powerful men feel protected, flattered, even a little dangerous. The first time I saw one of Epstein's social calendars years ago, before half the world even knew his name, I noticed something odd. The guests weren't grouped by political ideology. They weren't grouped by business sector or by nationality. They were grouped by utility. Who needed whom, who could offer what, who had something to lose. This is what most people don't understand. The powerful don't gather because they like each other. They gather because they need one another. And Epstein, this eccentric, strangely credentialed financier with a private island and a habit of surrounding himself with very young girls, was a connector in that ecosystem. He was the man who could get people into rooms they had no business being in. He was the man who could introduce billionaires to scientists, politicians to donors, celebrities to royalty. Let me paint you a picture of how someone like that becomes indispensable. Imagine you are a wealthy public figure, a senator, a CEO, a tech titan. You want access to a particular hedge fund manager, or a diplomat, or a Nobel Prize-winning scientist. You don't want to go through formal channels. Those leave trails. You want an introduction that feels casual, deniable, something that can be explained away as we bumped into each other at an event. Epstein specialized in exactly that. He built his entire social empire around the idea that the most compromising connections often start as mundane encounters. Now add a darker layer beneath that, the layer where relationships become leverage, the layer where a photograph, or a visit, or even a rumor becomes a tool. Epstein didn't need to blackmail anyone outright. All he needed to do was create situations where people weren't entirely sure who else knew what. Ambiguity is a kind of power. He was a master of it. I once spoke, quietly off the record, with a former intelligence officer who told me something I've never forgotten. He said, "In every global capital, there are people whose value isn't in what they do, but in what they know about others." When I asked him what he meant, he replied, "Epstein was one of those people. And there are fewer of them than you think. That's why this scandal cuts so deep. Because Epstein wasn't just a criminal with a Rolodex. He was a node in a network where the stakes are geopolitical. People in his orbit weren't just random rich men. They were individuals who influenced market regulation, national security decisions, foreign policy, media narratives, financial flows, and scientific research. Here's what really scares me. In politics, proximity matters. Even innocent proximity. A handshake, a shared flight, a dinner invitation, those become puzzle pieces. And when you gather enough puzzle pieces, you begin to see patterns of power that institutions have spent decades trying to obscure. That's what the Epstein-Files threaten. Not proof of guilt for every person he ever spoke to, but proof of proximity. Proof of access. Proof of the kinds of relationships that are never supposed to be visible to the public. And that's why people panic. Not because every name on a manifest is guilty of a crime, but because every name represents a question. And powerful people hate questions they can't control the answers to. Let me take you into a hypothetical I've used before in classified briefings. Imagine a foreign intelligence service obtains the full, unredacted Epstein evidence years before the public ever sees it. Now imagine how that intelligence can be used, not just to blackmail, but to pressure, to influence, to steer decisions quietly away from certain outcomes. That's not conspiracy. That's history. That's how intelligence has worked since intelligence existed. And yet, the public discussion collapses this entire reality into one crude phrase, client list, as if this were Vegas bottle service. As if reputations and regimes couldn't fall over the kinds of connections these documents reveal. So when you hear politicians talk casually about releasing the Epstein-Files, remember this: what terrifies them isn't just what Epstein did. It's what Epstein knew, who he connected, and how many careers, perhaps even entire institutions, could be destabilized if the raw truth ever surfaced without filters. Now we turn to Mike Johnson, a man who presents himself as a moral crusader, a constitutional purist, a steady hand. But in a system where Epstein functioned as a mirror for the powerful, Johnson now finds himself standing between that mirror and the public. And the question that haunts me is the question that should haunt all of us. Why does someone who claims to want transparency wield so much control over what we get to see? That's exactly where we're heading next. Enter Mike Johnson, the preacher, the constitutionalist, the gatekeeper. I want to be careful here, because this is where people tend to hear what they want to hear instead of what I'm actually saying. Mike Johnson is not a cartoon villain. He's not a mastermind. And he's not a clueless bystander either. He is something far more complicated and far more dangerous in a moment like this. A man who sincerely believes he is on the side of righteousness while occupying one of the most strategically powerful positions in the American government. Let me walk you through the paradox that is Mike Johnson. When he first arrived in Washington, he reminded me of the type I've seen many times. The earnest constitutionalist, the rule of law conservative who quotes scripture as fluently as he quotes the Federalist Papers. He had that small-town lawyer demeanor, measured voice, polite smile, the kind of man who sounds like he teaches Sunday school on the weekends. And he probably would have stayed that man, quietly drafting bills, voting his ideology, staying under the national radar, if not for one thing. He became Speaker. People outside Washington do not understand what the speakership really is. They think it's a ceremonial role, or a figurehead position, or a glorified traffic cop for legislation. No. The Speaker of the House is a gatekeeper of national reality. The Speaker controls what bills come to the floor, when they come to the floor, and whether they ever see daylight at all. The Speaker can accelerate history or bury it in paperwork. Let me paint you a picture of the ecosystem Johnson walked into the moment he grabbed that gavel. Picture a high-rise building with dozens of floors. Each floor represents a different power center: intelligence, appropriations, ethics, foreign affairs, judiciary, industry donors, presidential ambitions, party leadership. The moment Johnson became Speaker, every one of those floors started watching him, testing him, studying him. Is he manageable? Is he ideological? Is he naive? Is he controllable? Most new speakers lean heavily on their staff at first. But Johnson's staff found themselves in a pressure cooker, suddenly responsible for controlling the flow of information into and out of a man who wasn't fully prepared for the gravitational pull of the job. That matters, because information flow is the real currency of the speakership. What gets briefed to him? What doesn't? Who whispers in his ear? Which crises are presented as pressing, and which are framed as not urgent? Now bring the Epstein-Files into that picture. A set of documents containing allegations that could implicate wealthy donors, influential media figures, past presidents, current lawmakers, international elites. Materials that, depending on what version reaches the public, could reshape political alliances, destroy narratives, or force uncomfortable reckonings. Johnson stepped into the speakership right as pressure was mounting for Congress to act on releasing those documents. He inherited not only the demand for transparency, but the fear that transparency might be radioactive. Here's what really scares me. Johnson believes deeply in institutions, and people who believe deeply in institutions tend to do whatever is necessary to protect those institutions, even from truths that could destabilize them. I've seen this before with devout constitutionalists. They come to Washington wanting to serve the republic as they imagine it. Then they encounter the version that actually exists, the version where elite networks quietly shape outcomes, where sealed documents hold landmines, where one name in a file can trigger an international crisis. And that collision between ideals and realities either breaks them or turns them into guardians of the very system they once promised to reform. Johnson, I think, chose guardianship. Let me paint you a picture of what I suspect happened in those early months after he became Speaker. Johnson meets with committee chairs. They brief him on the Epstein pressure building on both sides of the aisle. They present the risks, donor blowback, national security flags, potential foreign intelligence implications, the possibility of destabilizing public trust months before an election. Staffers warn him about the precedent of releasing raw investigative material. Lawyers warn him about defamation risks. Party strategists warn him about collateral damage. And then someone, probably a senior counsel or an intelligence liaison, says what everyone else is dancing around. If we handle this wrong, it could ignite something we can't control. That's when the Speaker becomes a gatekeeper, whether he likes it or not. Here's what most people don't realize. In Washington, moral conviction doesn't make you transparent. It makes you cautious. It makes you calculate the responsible path. It makes you ask, how do we protect the country? Even when that question quietly becomes, how do we protect the institution? Or how do we protect ourselves? So when Johnson stood at the microphones and talked about transparency around the Epstein-Files, I didn't hear sincerity or insincerity. I heard strategy. I heard someone who has been briefed, really briefed, on what these documents contain, and who understands that the timing and format of their release could either be a political earthquake or a managed tremor. Let me be clear. I don't think Johnson is trying to hide his own name in those files. That's not the point. The point is that the Speaker of the House is now the man standing between the public and a raw, unfiltered look into a world where the powerful mingle with the depraved, and where the line between the two is sometimes thinner than we want to believe. And that brings us to the next part of the story, how Johnson's gatekeeping didn't begin with a bold public stance, but with something much more subtle and much more familiar to anyone who has watched Washington try to avoid a scandal. A slow walk, a stalling pattern, a delay that spoke louder than any press conference ever could. That's exactly where we're headed next. The slow walk, delays, excuses, and a missing vote. If you really want to understand how Washington hides something, don't look for dramatic gestures or midnight conspiracies. Look for the slow walk. Look for the gentle, deliberate drag of feet that's just subtle enough to seem accidental, but just coordinated enough that it never actually is. Let me walk you through how I watched this play out around the Epstein-Files. When pressure started building in Congress for a vote on releasing the documents, you could feel the tectonic plates shifting. Members from both parties, some motivated by genuine outrage, others by cynical political opportunity, were lined up behind the same demand: bring the release to the floor. Let the people see the truth. In a normal political climate, that kind of bipartisan momentum forces a speaker's hand. But instead of moving, Johnson's office began to outdrift. Not stonewall, not shut it down, drift. And in Washington, drifting is a tactic. The first sign was subtle. A key member whose signature would have guaranteed the vote, whose participation would have forced Johnson to act, had their swearing-in mysteriously delayed. Paperwork issues, they said. Scheduling complications. A procedural backlog. If you've never worked inside the House, that might sound plausible. But when you have worked inside the House, you know better. Every Congress has emergencies where a member must be sworn in instantly. Hospital rooms, private ceremonies, after-hours oaths administered by the Speaker himself. When leadership wants someone sworn in, it happens. Period. The idea that a simple administrative delay happened to occur precisely when that member's vote would unlock the Epstein documents, that's not a coincidence. That's choreography. Let me paint you a picture of what those days looked like behind the scenes. At 8 a.m., leadership staffers enter their daily briefing. Someone brings up the Epstein-File resolution. Someone else lists the members pushing for it. Eyes shift uncomfortably. The conversation drifts to broader priorities: floor congestion, pending appropriations, conference fragmentation, all legitimate concerns on the surface. But beneath the surface, everyone knows the real problem. The vote would pass. And when a vote is guaranteed to pass, the Speaker loses control of the narrative. So instead of saying no, which would have triggered open revolt, Johnson's office learned to say soon, "Let's look at the schedule. We're reviewing options." I've heard those lines 1,000 times. They translate to, "We need more time to figure out how to survive this." Then came the committee bottlenecks. Draft resolutions that needed technical adjustments. Subpoena language that required additional legal review. Transparency measures that had to be aligned with privacy considerations. These are the kinds of phrases that sound responsible, but function as strategic breaks. And watchdog groups began asking questions. Why is this taking so long? Why is the vote always next week? Why is there always one more procedural step? Here's what really scares me about the slow walk. It's the tactic politicians use when they're afraid of being caught doing the wrong thing, but equally afraid of doing the right thing. And within the walls of Congress, that fear was palpable. I remember a conversation with an old colleague still on the Hill. I asked him point blank why the vote was being stretched like taffy. He sighed, the kind of sigh that only staffers in untenable positions ever master, and said, "Because everybody wants the files released. Until they remember, they don't know what's in them." That's the paralysis. That's the fear. That's the engine of the slow walk. No one wanted to go on record opposing transparency. That's political suicide. But no one wanted to unleash something that could detonate their side, or both sides. And so, the perfect Washington solution emerged. Delay. Not denial. Not refusal. Delay. A delay quiet enough to avoid backlash. A delay long enough for pressure to dissipate, for negotiations behind closed doors, for agencies to comb through materials, for donors to call in favors, for careers to be recalculated in real time. But here's the part that made me sit up straighter. The moment the slow walk went from familiar tactic to glaring alarm, when Johnson finally realized that delay alone wouldn't save him. Because when the Epstein-Files became a catalyst for congressional paralysis, When procedural games started shutting down the House itself, Johnson crossed the invisible line between cautious leadership and active management of a scandal he couldn't fully control. And when a speaker reaches that point, history tells us something very specific. The next move will be bigger, more dramatic. A pivot meant to look brave instead of fearful. And that pivot is exactly what Johnson did next. That's where we go in the next, the moment the slow walk snapped into a sudden, very public change of direction. The shutdown gambit, when Epstein literally closed the House. There's a moment in every political scandal when the pressure builds to the point that subtlety stops working. You can stall. You can delay. You can review the language. You can hide behind committee procedures and technical edits. But then, suddenly, the dam creaks. And the people in power realize that if they don't take drastic action, they're going to lose control of the narrative entirely. For the Epstein-Files, that moment arrived the week the House just stopped. Let me walk you through how shocking that actually was. Congress, for all its flaws, runs on routine. Schedules, floor votes, procedural steps. Even chaos has a rhythm. When the House shuts down unexpectedly, when lawmakers are sent home abruptly, when sessions end early without a real explanation, that's not clerical mismanagement. That's an alarm bell. Someone, somewhere, has yanked the emergency brake. And that's exactly what happened. Pressure to release the Epstein documents had reached critical mass. Reporters were asking questions leadership didn't want to answer. Members were whispering that the delay was becoming indefensible. And on social media, voters across the political spectrum, left, right, and everything in between, were uniting around a singular demand: stop protecting the powerful. Release the files. Inside the building, you could feel the temperature rising. Staffers were tense. Committee aides were fielding frantic calls. Senior members were avoiding eye contact in hallways, like they were afraid someone might ask them when the vote was actually happening. And then, rather than bring the resolution to the floor, rather than face an uncomfortable debate that would expose fault lines within both parties, leadership simply ended the session early. Picture this. A chamber that should be bustling with arguments and legislative work suddenly falls into a hush. Members glance around, confused. Staffers whisper to each other, "Is this confirmed? Are we really adjourning? Is something happening behind the scenes?" They were. Something was happening. When the House effectively shut down, it wasn't because of spending bills or border fights or the usual partisan theatrics. It was because the Epstein vote had become a live wire. Too dangerous to touch. Too dangerous to ignore. Here's what really scares me. I've only seen the House shut down early like that a handful of times in my career. And every single time, it meant one of two things. Leadership had lost control of their caucus. Leadership was protecting the institution from something it didn't know how to absorb. This time, I suspect it was both. There were members who genuinely wanted the files released in full, raw, unfiltered, with no redactions except those that protected victims. And there were others, equally vocal behind closed doors, who were terrified of what their donors, their allies, or even their own families might see reflected in those documents. Johnson, caught between these factions, faced a nightmare scenario, a public vote he couldn't control the outcome of, a vote that could split his caucus, a vote that could permanently stain the speakership only months after he took it. So he did what leaders do when they're losing their grip on an explosive issue. He changed the subject. He stopped the clock. He walked everyone out of the building. Let me paint you a picture of why that worked for a moment. A sudden shutdown resets the narrative. It forces reporters to chase a different story. It buys time or leadership to regroup, time for lawyers to negotiate redactions, time for intelligence officials to weigh in, time for political strategists to calculate the least damaging path forward. It's a pressure release valve disguised as scheduling chaos. But it also sends a message to the insiders who know how to read the signals. Something big is happening behind closed doors, and we don't trust the chamber to handle it in public. I had a former colleague call me during that shutdown week. I could hear the agitation in his voice, that barely concealed panic staffers get when they know a decision above their pay grade has a potential to blow up in everyone's faces. He said, "We can't keep the lid on this much longer. There's too much momentum. They're going to have to make a move." And he was right. When the House shut down early, it wasn't the end of the story. It was the pivot point, the prelude. The moment leadership realized that delay had reached its limit and that the next move had to be bold enough to reassert control. That move, Mike Johnson's abrupt, dramatic public 180 on releasing the files, is where the Real story begins. It's the moment the slow walk turned into a sprint. And that's exactly the moment we turn to next. The sudden 180 Johnson's big public flip on the files. There's a certain kind of moment in politics that feels like watching a dam break. Not slowly, not over hours, but in a single, sharp crack. 1 second, the pressure is invisible, contained, politely denied. The next, it ruptures, and the people responsible for holding the wall together pretend they always intended to let the water through. Mike Johnson's sudden embrace of releasing the Epstein-Files was exactly that kind of moment. Let me walk you through what that pivot looked like from someone who's seen these reversals play out before, both from inside the room and from just outside the blast radius. For weeks, Johnson had been drifting, avoiding, delaying. He hadn't taken a hard public stance either way, and that silence was strategic. When a leader doesn't know which option will hurt them more, they buy time. That's politics at its most primal. Then, almost overnight, he stepped in front of cameras with his calm, almost serene confidence and announced a new position. He supported releasing the Epstein-Files. He encouraged the process. He said there was nothing to hide. He treated transparency as if it had been his plan from the start. You could feel reporters stumble over their own surprise. Even some members of his own caucus raised their eyebrows. This wasn't just a shift. It was a controlled detonation, a preemptive strike before someone else could define the narrative. And the way he delivered it told me something crucial. This wasn't spontaneity. This was preparation. Let me paint you a picture of what likely happened in the days leading up to that press conference. Imagine a series of meetings, not dramatic ones, not late-night cinematic confrontations, but the quiet, surgical kind that matter far more. Meetings with committee chairs. Meetings with legal counsel. Meetings with the Department of Justice. Meetings with intelligence liaisons who don't answer to voters, but do answer to threat assessments. In one meeting, Johnson is briefed on the political risks of continued delay, polling numbers, donor tensions, the danger of appearing complicit. In another, he's briefed on the national security concerns of releasing certain material unredacted. In yet another, lawyers outline what can be made public without triggering lawsuits or compromising minors. Then someone hands him a document. It's not the Epstein-Files themselves. It's a structured plan, a roadmap. The version of the truth that leadership believes the public can absorb without triggering institutional collapse. And buried somewhere in that plan is the assurance every politician craves when standing near a live grenade. You can survive this. That assurance is what turns hesitation into confidence. Here's what really scares me, and this comes from years of reading the political temperature of a room. When a leader shifts from fear to certainty overnight, it means someone has promised them control. Control over timing. Control over redactions. Control over the framing. Control over which truths become public and which remain sealed under the familiar armor of victim privacy, investigative integrity, or national security. This is why I've been emphasizing that releasing the Epstein-Files is not a binary choice. It's not open or closed. It's not hidden or revealed. In Washington, transparency is never absolute. It is curated, managed, strategically portioned. And Johnson's sudden 180 didn't just signal that the files would be released. It signaled that the version of the files heading toward the public had already been shaped. Let me walk you into a hypothetical that's uncomfortably plausible. A Justice Department official presents Johnson with a set of proposed redactions. Names blacked out. Details thinned. Context softened. Enough to appear transparent, not enough to destabilize the donor networks, the party hierarchies, the diplomatic relationships, or the intelligence partnerships that intersect, often quietly, with Epstein's world. Johnson looks at that version and realizes something. This is survivable. Politically survivable. Institutionally survivable. Personally survivable. And now releasing the files becomes not a threat, but an asset. A shield. A way to appear righteous without risking real damage to the people who matter. So he steps up to the microphones and says the magic words. I support releasing everything. There's nothing to hide. The shift was so smooth that many voters swallowed it whole. But insiders, we knew. I remember texting someone still on the Hill, so he finally got the message. They replied with a single line. He finally got the green light. That's what this is about. The moment the political class decided that controlled exposure was less dangerous than continued secrecy. The moment Johnson realized he could survive this storm as long as he held the umbrella. But the real question now, the one we turn to next, is this. If Johnson is suddenly confident enough to release the files, what does that tell us about what those files look like today? Now imagine what those files look like today. When people hear the phrase release the Epstein-Files, they picture something cinematic, a safe cracking open, a dusty stack of folders emerging untouched, unedited, unaltered, truth in its purest form. I wish that were how this worked. It isn't. Not even close. Let me walk you into the reality, the windowless reality, of what those files probably look like now, after months of political maneuvering, legal vetting, intelligence input, and behind-the-scenes negotiation. Imagine a room deep inside the Department of Justice. No windows. Fluorescent lights humming. A long metal table covered with documents, drives, binders, logs. 3 government attorneys sit on one side. On the other side sit 2 representatives from the U.S. Attorney's Office, plus an intelligence liaison from one of the 3-letter agencies you only hear about in passing. In the center of the table, the Epstein-Files. But not the raw Epstein-Files. Something else. Something already transformed. Here's what really scares me, and this is based on what I've seen happen in other cases that never made the evening news. Before those documents ever reach Congress, before they ever come close to the public, they go through a process that looks clinical on the surface and deeply political underneath. Technical terms do the dirty work: harm minimization, privacy protections, ongoing investigative equities, interagency coordination, national security sensitivities. What they mean in plain English is, someone is deciding who gets protected. Someone is deciding which truths the public can handle. Someone is drawing the moral boundaries of transparency for all of us. Let me paint you a picture of how this sorting works, because I've been in rooms like this. To the left of the table, a stack labeled Safe TO Release. This stack includes anything that's already public through court filings, media reporting, or unsealed civil suits. This is the nothing new here pile. The one meant to pacify the public. Next to it, a second stack labeled Sensitive but Releasable with redactions. This is where staff place material that contains explosive details, travel logs, contact records, financial transfers, coded communications, but can be rendered safe by blacking out the right names, the right dates, the right identifying details. The magic trick here is that redactions can strip out context while appearing protective. Then there's the third stack, Do Not Release. This pile is the real heart of the matter. The material here may involve intelligence assets, foreign nationals, active investigations, or individuals whose exposure would cause disproportionate destabilization. That last phrase is simultaneously bureaucratic and chilling. It's used when naming a person would be more politically destructive than the system wants to risk. And then there's a fourth category, one most people don't know exists: reclassify or reframe. This isn't about hiding the truth. It's about redefining it. Changing labels, recategorizing evidence, rewriting summaries, scrubbing context, turning a name into an initial, turning an allegation into a claim, turning a pattern into a set of unrelated incidents. This is the art of shaping the version of reality that becomes public record. Now imagine this process repeated over and over, with input from lawyers, intelligence analysts, political strategists, ethics advisors, and communication staff. Every one of them has a different priority. None of their priorities is tell the full truth without fear or favor. Not because they're evil, not because they're villains, but because the system trains them to protect the structure above all else. Here's what truly unsettles me. By the time these documents reach Mike Johnson's desk, they have already gone through weeks, maybe months of coordinated curation. The raw truth is long gone. What remains is something cleaner, gentler, politically survivable. And this is where things get even darker. Because I promise you, someone has already calculated the acceptable losses. Someone has decided which names are expendable, which reputations can take a hit, which individuals no longer hold political value. Those people will appear in the documents. Their exposure will be framed as bravery. See? We released everything. But the names with gravity, the names with leverage, the names tied to donors, to intelligence ties, to former presidents, to powerful institutions, Those names can be buried behind a single black box of ink, hidden by a phrase like protected subject, shielded by ongoing investigation. Let me give you a thought experiment to make this clear. Imagine a flight log shows a powerful individual flew to Epstein's Island 3 times. Raw file name, dates, locations. Processed file redacted, 1998, 2001, 2003. Final public version, multiple individuals of interest traveled. Do you see the shift? Truth becomes suggestion. Fact becomes anonymity. Accountability becomes fog. Now imagine this playing out across hundreds of pages, thousands of entries, dozens of names. And so when Johnson gets up in front of the microphones and says, "There's nothing to hide," it hits me in a way most people don't catch. He's not lying. He's describing the curated version of the truth he has already been shown. The version engineered to be safe. The version engineered to be responsible. The version engineered to be releasable. But not the whole truth. That version will never see daylight. Not unless something breaks inside the system. Not unless someone decides that protecting the institution is finally less important than revealing the rot. And that brings us to the bigger picture, because the public thinks the danger is what's in the files. But the real danger is how those files are about to be weaponized by every faction with something to gain or something to lose. That's where we're going next. How truth gets weaponized, left, right, and everyone in between. There's a fantasy people cling to, and I understand why. It's the fantasy that once the Epstein-Files are released, there will be clarity, justice, a moment of national honesty where the truth finally stands on its own. But that isn't how truth works in Washington. And it sure as hell isn't how truth works in an election year. Let me walk you through the reality. Truth is not a neutral force in this town. Truth is a weapon. Truth is ammunition. Truth is a currency traded by people who care more about advantage than accountability. And the Epstein-Files, in any form, curated or raw, are about to become one of the most valuable caches of political ammunition in modern history. Picture what happens the moment those documents drop. Before the public even has time to download the PDFs, both parties' war rooms will already be combing through them. They'll have interns, analysts, lawyers, rapid responders, all hunting for one thing, a name they can use. Not a pattern. Not a system. A name? One name is all it takes to launch a narrative, and narratives are how power shifts hands in this country. Let me paint you a picture of those first 48 hours. On the left, operatives will be searching for Republican donors, Republican lawmakers, Republican appointees. Anyone whose ties to Epstein can be spun into an indictment of the entire conservative establishment. They'll splice together clips, curate timelines, flood social media with graphics. They'll do it fast because speed is the modern currency of outrage. On the right, commentators will be refreshing the files like day traders watching a volatile stock, praying for a recognizable Hollywood liberal, a Democratic strategist, an Ivy League president, a legacy media figure. They won't be looking for truth, they'll be looking for vindication. They'll be looking for a counterpunch. And they'll get one because Epstein's world didn't fit neatly into partisan boundaries. It never did. Cable panels will erupt, not with questions about victims or the systemic nature of abuse, but about which names fit whose narrative. Social media will become a battlefield of out-of-context screenshots, redacted lines framed as confessions, and speculation treated as confirmed fact. Here's what really scares me. In that frenzy, survivors' voices will vanish. I've seen it happen before. Every major scandal involving powerful men follows the same pattern. The first wave is moral outrage. The second wave is political positioning. By the third wave, it has become pure tribal warfare, and the people who suffer the actual harm are drowned out by the people fighting over how to interpret their suffering. I remember a moment in another high-profile case, a different set of victims, a different predator, but the same dynamic. We released a set of documents, heavily redacted, with careful language. Within hours, one side claimed it proved a conspiracy against them, while the other side claimed it exposed the moral bankruptcy of their opponents. I watched survivors watching the coverage. Their faces told me everything. They weren't watching a search for truth. They were watching their trauma get weaponized like a political bludgeon. That's the danger here. Not just lies, not just cover-ups, but instrumentalization, the transformation of human suffering into partisan leverage. And it gets worse. Because the Epstein documents won't just be weaponized against political opponents, they'll be weaponized to protect allies. Let me explain what I mean by that. If a name appears in these files that is inconvenient to one faction, that faction will move heaven and earth to contextualize, minimize, or discredit it. They'll say it was a misunderstanding, an innocent meeting, a malicious misinterpretation. They'll release friendly experts, friendly commentators, friendly lawyers, all to muddy the water before the facts fully settle. Meanwhile, if a name appears that benefits them politically, suddenly context won't matter. Suddenly one flight log entry becomes an indictment. One deposition reference becomes guilt. One adjacency becomes proof of participation. They'll amplify it, distort it, strip it of nuance, and frame it as the moral failing of an entire ideology. This is how truth becomes poison. And the worst part? This weaponization doesn't just distort the present, it distorts the future. Because once the Epstein-Files become a battleground, every future scandal, every future abuse case, every future whistleblower account will be filtered through the tribal lens created by this one moment. The system will learn that even when truth gets out, the power players can still manipulate it. And that teaches them the most dangerous lesson of all. You can survive anything if you control the narrative. This is the pattern I've been trying to show you, the pattern I learned from years of watching insiders do damage control, spin, narrative architecture. And Epstein represents the most extreme, the most grotesque stress test imaginable for that pattern. Because here's the truth. This scandal isn't about Epstein anymore. It's about what happens when the public finally gets a glimpse behind the curtain, and the people who built the curtain scramble to decide how much of that glimpse they could tolerate. In the next, we go deeper. Not into the politics, into the machinery behind the politics. The laws, the classifications, the secrecy architecture, the system that decides what you get to know and what you don't. Because once you see how that machine works, you'll understand why the Epstein-Files were always destined to be weaponized and never destined to be fully revealed. The system behind the scandal, classification, FOIA, and the illusion of transparency. If you really want to understand what's happening with the Epstein-Files, not the drama, not the headlines, but the structural reality, we have to talk about a machine most Americans never see. A machine built out of statutes, secrecy protocols, precedent, bureaucracy, and fear. A machine that determines every single day what the public gets to know and what remains sealed away under the comforting vocabulary of protection. Let me walk you through that machine piece by piece. Because once you see how it works, everything else in this story will snap into focus. The architecture of secrecy. Most people think classification is about national security, nuclear codes, troop deployments, intelligence sources. And yes, that's a part of it. But classification is also about political stability, institutional stability, reputational stability. I've watched documents get classified not because they threaten national safety, but because they threaten national comfort. In every agency, classification follows the same hierarchy. Top secret, catastrophic if revealed. Secret, serious damage if revealed. Confidential, embarrassing, disruptive, or sensitive. That last category, sensitive, is the one nobody talks about. Because sensitive can mean anything from undercover operations to, frankly, this will make powerful people furious. Let me paint you a picture. An investigator uncovers a set of emails showing that a federal official ignored warnings about Epstein years before his arrest. That official has connections, influence, maybe even friends on a powerful committee. What classification level protects the institution? The answer is whatever classification level keeps that document from being subpoenaed, leaked, or landed in the hands of a journalist. FOIA, the promise that isn't. The Freedom of Information Act sounds beautiful, democratic, empowering. But FOIA isn't a door, it's a maze. And the people who build it know every twist. When you file a FOIA request, 3 things immediately happen. Lawyers determine how to narrow the scope. Analysts apply exemptions. Reviewers ask, what do we not have to release? FOIA exemptions are supposed to protect privacy and security. Some do, but others are loopholes wide enough to drive a motorcade through. Take exemption B7C, the one used to protect personal privacy in law enforcement records. Sounds noble, right? But I've seen it used to hide everything from misconduct to institutional failures. And most Americans can't fight back because appealing a FOIA denial requires money, lawyers, and time. Three things regular citizens don't have in abundance. Grand jury secrecy, the government's Fort Knox. Grand jury material is protected under Rule 6E. You cannot FOIA it. You cannot subpoena it. You cannot leak it without risking prison. Guess where much of the Epstein information sits? Behind that wall. And guess who controls whether any of it is ever released? Judges, prosecutors, not the public, not Congress, not even the Speaker. Internal agency reviews, the black box inside the black box. Inside DOJ and federal agencies, there are committees whose entire job is to review sensitive evidence and recommend what can and cannot be disclosed. Let me tell you how those meetings sound, because I've sat in them. Someone says, this will damage ongoing operations. Someone else adds, this could violate victim privacy. Then someone lowers their voice and says the real reason. This could bring serious scrutiny to how we handled this case. Those words, how we handle this case, are the quiet confession no one puts in writing. It means mistakes. It means institutional failure. In the Epstein story, there were plenty of both. The illusion of transparency. When agencies release documents, often heavily redacted, they want you to believe you're seeing the truth. You're not. You're seeing a version of the truth. One engineered through redaction, selective withholding, classification decisions, non-responsive determinations, and risk calculations designed to protect the system as much as the public. Here's what really scares me. Most Americans don't know that transparency in this country is often curated opacity disguised as disclosure. I remember a case years ago where we released a 400-page document that looked damning on the surface. Reporters ran wild with it. But what they didn't know was that the most incriminating sections, the ones involving senior officials, were quietly removed under the label deliberative process materials. Deliberative process. A phrase so bland it sounds harmless. But in practice, it's one of the broadest shields in the entire American secrecy apparatus. Why this matters for Epstein? Once you understand the architecture of secrecy, you understand why I keep saying the real question isn't whether Johnson will release the files. It's what version of the files he's already agreed to release. A version consistent with the system's instincts. Protect the institution. Protect the powerful. Protect the narrative. The Epstein-Files are the perfect storm, a case that threatens national psyche, bipartisan networks, intelligence secrets, donor ecosystems, and public faith in the very concept of accountability. That's why the machine is working overtime right now. Not to hide nothing, but to hide enough. Where we go next? Now that you understand the machinery behind the curtain, we need to turn toward the people who get forgotten in all of this, the ones whose lives never make it into those deliberative process memos, the ones who don't have a legal team or a PR consultant shaping their narrative. The survivors. The children. The collateral damage of a system that protects itself first. That's where we go in the next. The people we keep forgetting. Survivors, children, and collateral damage. There is a moment I dread in every high-profile abuse case, a moment I've watched unfold again and again, the point when the political battle becomes louder than the human suffering that started it all. When the names of powerful men dominate headlines, but the names of the victims are reduced to initials, shadows, redacted lines on a PDF. Let me walk you through why this moment is so dangerous and why it matters more than anything else in this entire story. For all the talk about transparency and the Epstein-Files and institutional accountability, there is a brutal, uncomfortable truth at the center of this scandal. Real human beings were hurt, and they continue to live with the consequences of that harm long after the cameras shut off. I've sat across from survivors in private rooms where the air itself feels fragile. I watched them try to stay composed as they explain what happened to them, slowly, cautiously, as if every word might shatter something they've used years to rebuild. Let me paint you a picture. A young woman sits at a table, her hands trembling. Not because of the camera, there isn't one. Not because she's worried about her reputation, she lost that years ago when the system failed her. She trembles because every time she speaks these words aloud, she relives them. And every time she relives them, some part of her still hopes the people in the room will actually listen this time. I remember one survivor from a different case, a case the public never even heard about. She told her story 3 times in one day, because 3 separate teams, needed to hear it firsthand. By the end of that day, she couldn't speak. She stared at the table, eyes vacant, fingers locked around a paper cup until it crumpled. And after she left, the first question in the room wasn't, how do we help her? It was, is this politically manageable? That's the cruelty baked into the system. It sees victims as variables, not people. Now imagine being a survivor in the Epstein case. Imagine turning on the TV and seeing powerful men argue about the files like they're baseball stats or political leverage. Imagine watching pundits dissect your trauma like a talking point. Imagine hearing members of Congress use your suffering as a rhetorical weapon, claiming moral high ground while simultaneously negotiating which names to protect. Here's what really scares me. Survivors don't just get ignored. They get weaponized. Their stories become props. Their pain becomes strategy. Their bodies become battlegrounds for narratives crafted by people who will never experience a fraction of what they endured. Let me take you into a thought experiment I've used when training younger investigators. Imagine you are one of Epstein's survivors. You've spent years trying to rebuild your life. You've endured interviews, testimony, therapy, nightmares, medical exams, humiliation. You've watched Epstein die in a jail cell before he was forced to face you in court. You've watched Maxwell get convicted, but only on some charges, only in ways that protected the system from deeper exposure. And now imagine you're watching Congress, and you see a speaker, Mike Johnson, stand at a podium and announce with a practiced smile that there's nothing to hide. How would you feel? Would you believe him? Would you think he was talking about your story or about someone else's comfort? Survivors know the difference between actual transparency and political theater. They can feel it. Their instincts are sharper than most politicians' briefings. I'll tell you something I learned early in my career. Victims don't want spectacle. They don't want revenge. They don't want fame. They want acknowledgement. They want honesty. They want someone to tell the truth without running it through a political filter. But the Epstein-Files are not being processed through an empathy lens. They're being processed through a risk management lens. Legal risk, political risk, institutional risk. Survivors are not risks. They are people forced into the margins of a story they lived in the center of. And the younger ones, the ones who were groomed at an age where they could barely articulate what was happening, carry wounds that most adults can't even name. Trauma disrupts neural development. It rewires your sense of safety. It fractures trust in ways that don't heal linearly. Some of these survivors will spend the rest of their lives navigating symptoms and scars they never asked to carry. Let me show you something most people never think about. The Epstein-Files are not just records of crimes. They are records of abandoned responsibility. Every page reflects not just what Epstein did, but what institutions allowed to happen, what adults failed to stop, what systems failed to prevent. When the public finally sees whatever version of the files gets released, they will look at the names, the connections, the scandals. But survivors? They will look at the redactions, at the missing context, at the details withheld for their own protection, and they will know exactly what those choices really mean. Here's the truth most people can't bear to say out loud. If the system truly cared about survivors, we wouldn't have had an Epstein story in the first place. He was enabled by gatekeepers, protected by networks, overlooked by people who knew better. And now that same system is managing the release of his files. This needs to end on the moment that matters most. Survivors are watching. They see the hesitation. They see the redactions. They see the political calculations. And they are asking the question the rest of us must confront. If the system couldn't protect us then, why should we trust it to tell the truth now? In the next, we're going to widen the lens even further, into the futures that await us depending on whether we confront the full truth or continue sleepwalking into the version of reality the system chooses for us. The future we're sleepwalking toward, and the choice we still have. There's a moment that comes near the end of every major scandal, where the country stands at a fork in the road. Most people don't notice it when it happens. It isn't dramatic. It's not marked by a speech or a headline. It's quiet, deceptively quiet. But it's the moment when we decide collectively whether we're going to confront the truth or accept a myth because it's easier to live with. We are standing in that moment right now, and most of us don't realize it. Let me walk you through the two futures I see, because I've lived long enough inside the machinery of power to know exactly how this can play out. Future 1. The path of least resistance. This is the future the system expects, the future it has been engineering quietly through redactions, curated disclosures, and political choreography. In this future, the Epstein-Files are released in a form that seems transparent but isn't. Enough information is provided to create the illusion of closure. Enough is withheld to protect the people who truly matter. Cable news explodes for a week. Names trend on social media. 2 or 3 high-profile figures take a reputational hit, people who were already expendable or politically isolated. A handful of civil lawsuits are filed. Congress holds symbolic hearings. Committees issue strongly worded reports full of passive voice sentences like mistakes were made, and then the storm dies down. Not because justice has been served, but because the system has mastered the art of exhausting public attention until outrage runs out of oxygen. Let me paint you a picture. 6 months from now, you walk into a grocery store. The tabloids at the checkout counter have already moved on to a different scandal. The headlines about the Epstein-Files have faded. The big names exposed are subjects of documentaries, not indictments. Survivors are still waiting for support that never comes. And the deeper networks, the ones that enabled Epstein, protected Epstein, benefited from Epstein, quietly resumed their work. Life goes back to normal. But it's a poison normal. Because in this future, the message is clear. If you're powerful enough, connected enough, wealthy enough, the worst thing you will ever face is embarrassment. And once a democracy accepts that, truly accepts it, something fundamental breaks. Not loudly, not suddenly, but silently, like a fault line shifting beneath your feet. Future 2, the hard road, the one that actually fixes something. This future is harder, more painful, more disruptive. It's the one our system fears because it requires confronting the truth without filters, without curated narratives, without excuses. In this future, the public demands, relentlessly, an independent, survivor-centered truth process. Not a committee run by political actors. Not a DOJ review shaped behind the scenes. Something more radical. A genuinely independent body with the authority to unseal, investigate, and hold accountable regardless of status, party, wealth, or title. In this future, we stop pretending redaction is always about protection. We stop allowing classification to serve as a shield for reputations. We stop letting ongoing investigations become a permanent burial ground for evidence. Let me paint you a picture of this future, too. A former senator testifies under oath. A billionaire donor faces real consequences. A former agency official is forced to explain what they ignored, who they protected, and why. Survivors watch the process unfold not from the margins, but from the center. No longer props, but witnesses whose voices shape the national reckoning. And maybe, just maybe, a generation of children who never knew Epstein's name grows up believing that power in this country is not a free pass to secrecy and abuse. Maybe they see accountability not as an aspiration, but as a precedent. This future is possible, but it is not inevitable. It requires something the American public hasn't been asked to give in a long time: sustained moral focus. The kind of focus that doesn't evaporate when the news cycle changes. The kind that refuses to accept the curated version of events we are being prepared to swallow. Here's what really scares me. Most nations don't collapse because of one scandal. They collapse because of the stories they choose to tell themselves afterward. If we choose the easy story, the one where the system gives us just enough truth to keep us docile, then the lesson future predators will learn is chillingly simple. Do whatever you want. The institution will protect itself, not the innocent. And if that's the lesson this country absorbs, then Epstein won't be an anomaly. He'll be a blueprint. The hinge point. I've spent this entire video walking you through patterns: the slow walk, the shutdown, the 180-degree flip, the curated truth, the political weaponization, the machinery of secrecy. But all of that leads here to one simple reality. We are at a hinge point in American history. The choice we make right now to demand the full truth or to accept a partial one will define how future predators operate, how future institutions respond, and how deeply we still believe in the idea of justice. I'm going to end this with a line that's been echoing in my head for weeks. The line I can't shake. The line that keeps me up at night. In the end, the real secret isn't what's in the files. It's how little we're willing to do once we finally see them. That's the choice in front of us now. And pretending it isn't a choice is the most dangerous illusion of all. This is an imagined political thriller story, not a real classified leak or inside intelligence.